Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Igor Chikarin from the History Department, and I am delighted to introduce Professor Marc Landry, whose talk today is entitled Europe's Battery, the Alps in the Fossil Fuel Age. Marc Landry is an assistant professor of Central European History at and also the associate director of Center Austria, the Austrian Marshall Plan Center for European Studies at the University of New Orleans. As you know, much better located now in this time of the year. In New Orleans, he teaches courses in Central European history as well as global and environmental history. He also served as a guest professor at the University of Innsbruck. His research focuses on the environmental history of modern Europe. He has held fellowships such as the Fulbright and from organizations such as the German Academic Exchange Service and the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. His research on the environmental history of the Alps has appeared in the journal Environmental History, and he is currently completing a book manuscript on the history of the Alps as a renewable energy landscape. So today his talk is taking place in my class, Global Tourism and the Environment, which examines how people have interacted with the natural environment since the 18th century through the lens of tourism. I have 78 students, and I would like to remind them that it is their class, and they should not be shy about asking questions in the Q&A. Finally, I'd like to thank the Center for Austrian Studies for making this talk possible. So without further ado, I give you the floor, Marc.
Thank you very much, Professor Chikarin, for the kind introduction, and greetings to everybody from stormy New Orleans. Hopefully the power remains on during this talk. I also want to say thank you very much, Professor Chikarin, for the invitation to talk in this class. It seems like a really fascinating subject. I looked at the syllabus, really interesting, and thank all of you for attending. And finally, I'd also like to say thanks to the Center for Austrian Studies at the University of Minnesota and Howard Lauthan for this invitation and for the efforts to increase cooperation between the various Austrian centers worldwide. So I guess without further ado then, I'll launch into my talk here. Today, I want to tell you a little bit about my research, how I got into this topic of the environmental history of the Alps, and what I think are some of the interesting findings. So I will share my screen. So in a nutshell, right now, I'm working on a book-length project on the history of the Alps as a landscape of renewable energy. So I call this talk Europe's Battery, the Alps in the Fossil Fuel Age. And originally, I had set out with a more narrow research topic. I was interested in looking at the history of hydroelectric dam building in the Eastern Alps. But as I was doing research, I started uncovering clues that maybe there was a bigger story here, one that I should follow up. So I want to share with you here one of these clues that I found, one of these documents that convinced me that I should perhaps frame my research a little bit more broadly. So what we're looking at here is a document that I found in the archives in Vienna, and it's written in German. Maybe some of you up in Minnesota can read German. If you can't, no problem. I'll sort of paraphrase what's here. But this is a document from March 1939, a year after the state of Austria had been incorporated into the Third Reich, into Nazi Germany. And it's about a half a year before the beginning of the Second World War. And this letter is from the newly created energy czar for Nazi Germany. This was a position that the number 2 Nazi official Hermann Göring had created. And if you look in the corner up here, you can actually see that the document uses Göring's letterhead. So Göring created this czar position because the German electricity supply was starting to run into bottlenecks. And at this point in time, the German war economy, or at least rearmament, was running on all cylinders. Vast amounts of electricity were needed. And so Goering appointed an energy czar to try to deal with these energy bottlenecks and to free up more, particularly electricity, for the German war economy. And in this letter, then we see this newly appointed energy czar writing to an official in Vienna, and he's stating his opinion that the exploitation of Alpine water power in Austria is the most important issue for the energy system of Nazi Germany in the near future. So when I read this document, I was pretty surprised, because to reiterate, 5 months before Nazi Germany started the Second World War, the German energy czar, top German energy planner, saw the Alps and Alpine water power as crucial to the German war effort. And so it was documents like these that really pushed me to decide to frame my research as a broader history of the Alps, not just looking at one region or some individual dams, but to frame it as a history of the Alps in general. Because I had here evidence that people at the time viewed the Alps as a distinct landscape of energy resources. And also, this is evidence that at certain times during the history of the 20th century, this Alpine energy was at the center of the historical drama taking place in Europe. One final sort of thought is, I think, trying to frame a history of Europe based upon the transformation of one of its most iconic landscapes is a good example of the new perspectives that we can gain on history if we shift our focus slightly. So I'm an environmental historian, and essentially environmental historians argue that we will not have a full understanding of history until we add nature into the picture. And so by focusing instead of the history of a nation state, if we look at it through the lens of a transnational landscape, we see different perspectives on European history. And in this case, we see that the Alps, a landscape that's usually thought of for its pristine nature, was actually one of the most important industrial regions, at least in terms of energy. So we see a new perspective on the Alps. We see that the struggle over Alpine energy was at the heart, as I said, of the tumult gripping Europe at the time. And from the perspective of energy history, the Alps are also a very interesting case study, because the Alps became one of the most important landscapes of renewable energy. So if we're interested in understanding how renewable energy has been used in the past, the Alps offer an interesting case study of a success story, if you will. So the broad question that I've been trying to answer with my research is, how and why did the Alps become such an important energy landscape? And my general argument is that we should understand the Alps in the 20th century as Europe's battery, essentially the most important source of alternative energy to fossil fuels that existed on the European continent. If anybody was hunting for energy that was not fossil fuels, basically coal, in Europe, in West Central Europe in particular, the biggest store was to be found in the Alps. And this is because the Alps had a lot of high energy water. What I mean by that is essentially water that's rushing very fast downhill, possessing a lot of energy. But the Alps also possessed something even more special than that. The Alps had ways to store this energy, to impound the water, so that Europeans could exercise more control over what they saw as fickle nature. Now, I'm going to talk more about this storage issue later. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of this history, I just want to point up one aspect of this research that I also see as having direct connections to your class, and I think it's summed up nicely by this poster, which is an advertisement for an international exhibition that took place in the Alpine city of Grenoble in 1925. So as you can tell from the text on the poster, This was the exposition on huile blanche. I'm sorry for my terrible French, but to translate, that meant white coal and tourism. And white coal was the term that French people had coined to refer to the water power of the Alps. And so, you know, what this shows in one poster, I think, is that the history of energy in the Alps and history of tourism are connected. If you look at the figure depicted here, you know, this allegorical figure showing money or coins falling out of her hands, it suggests that both energy and tourism were natural resources that were available in the Alps. And whether you saw one or the other really just depended on who you were. If you were an engineer, you saw the Alps as a source of energy. If you were a hotelier, of tourism. So we can see here that there's a connection, even at the time, made between the Alps as an energy landscape and as a tourist landscape. I also think that in material terms, it was the energy being exploited in the Alps that laid the foundation for a lot of this important tourist infrastructure. So thinking about lights and ski lifts, etc. Okay, before delving too deeply into the history, I want to also establish what I mean when I say Europe's battery. Because it is very easy to look at the Alps and not understand that they are, at this moment, one of Europe's most important energy producing landscapes. Energy production in the Alps is quite hidden. So just in a broad sort of overview, presently there's something like 550 hydropower plants in the Alps that can generate over 10 megawatts of electricity. And to give you a sense of how much 10 megawatts can achieve, that's enough electricity to power about 10,000 households for a year. If we look at annual production, some people have calculated that 96 terawatt hours are produced through Alpine water power annually. And in order to replace this amount of energy, it would require the burning of something like 23 million tons of hard coal. So the Alps at this very moment are one of the most important components of Europe's electricity grid. And you could compare it in this respect to things like German coal fields, French nuclear power, or even North Sea oil and gas. Now that's the present moment. Earlier in the 20th century, we did not have nuclear power. Natural gas was not so common as an electricity producer. So earlier in the 20th century, the Alps loomed even larger. They were the main alternative to coal for producing electricity. But it's not only the quantity of energy in the Alps, but it's the quality. And this is getting back to the storage issue that I mentioned earlier. Around 1900, engineers began to argue that the Alps were special because they offered so many opportunities to store water power and therefore electricity. And this was something unique. Storing water power gave Europeans greater control over what were seen as fickle flows of natural energy. And what were these opportunities to store water power? Essentially existing lakes and valleys where you could build a dam wall, and store the water behind it. So this map that we're looking at comes from the Alpine Convention, which is a nature conservation group. And it shows currently the number and size of reservoirs, of storage basins for water power in the European Alps. So you can get a sense that this is quite a large figure. Something like 200 new lakes were created over the course of the 20th century to store this energy. And some person calculated roughly the volume of concrete that was poured into these dam foundations. And they found that it was something like 10 times more than existed or than exists at the Great Pyramids in Egypt. So this is truly an engineering wonder of the world. Okay, so that's sort of the overview of how much energy, what type of energy has been harnessed in the Alps. Now I want to go back to my main question, which is why did this landscape get exploited in the way that it did? Why did the Alps become Europe's battery? To do that, we first have to consider a little bit more about the Alps and other mountains' role in natural terrestrial cycles. So now we're going to get into a little bit of environmental knowledge here. So here's a handy diagram from the US Geological Survey illustrating the water cycle. And from an environmental standpoint, the Alps can be considered Europe's water tower. Now, this has to do with their position in Europe, sandwiched between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. So the Alps are constantly being buffeted by moist air masses coming from the seas. And as this diagram shows us, when these moist air masses, the clouds, hit the mountaintops, they're forced upwards, which causes them to cool, and then they drop their moisture in the form of precipitation. So in the summertime, in the warmer months, when the clouds drop their moisture, it falls as rain and then runs off the mountains on its way towards the sea. In the wintertime, this water often freezes. It'll fall as snow, and it will end up in either ice pack or snowpack on the mountains. So in terms of the hydrological cycle, the water cycle, the mountains play this important role of rain catcher. Now I'm going to switch over to some sort of broad thoughts about energy history to give you a context for the role that the Alps would eventually come to play here. So one prominent energy historian entitled his book on the human history of energy use, Children of the Sun. And what he wanted to emphasize was that almost all usable energy on the planet actually comes from the sun. It derives from the solar energy of the sun. For the most part, humans tap into indirect flows of this solar energy. And that's what happens when humans use water power. So, Children of the Sun, most of our energy is coming from the sun. Thinking about human history, energy history in the long term, we could see it in one sense as the struggle to get solar energy flows to be useful to certain groups. Energy needs to be put in the right form, at the right place, at the right time. Those are the three key challenges. The right form, that could be heat or mechanical. The right place means transportation, and the right time. Now we need to keep in mind these three keys, because that's going to be one big reason why the Alps become so important. Now, for 1,000 years prior to the 19th century, humans had figured out a way to intervene in that hydrological cycle that I just showed you, where the water falls on the mountains and rushes to the seas. They figured out a way to tap into those flows of energy by intervening in the cycle. And the technology that they used to do this is what you see right here, an old idyllic Alpine mill. And you can hopefully see on the side of the picture there, a trough that would have carried the water from the mountains to a wheel that would be spun here and then perform some usable work. And these were widespread in the Alps up until the 19th century. It worked fine. Humans were able to do a lot of work using this energy. But starting in the 19th century, some people began to search for ways to extract more power out of the mountains. And this was part of the general economic expansion that we associate with the Industrial Revolution. I'm going to give you a little bit of some background on the energy context of the Industrial Revolution, because this is important for our story as well. From an energy standpoint, the Industrial Revolution was sustained because it created a new way to convert energy, the steam engine. And what was so revolutionary about the steam engine was it was the first device to allow humans to use heat to perform work and turn it into motion. So when the British, this is where the steam engine was really invented and refined, when they began to use coal to power their steam engines, they tapped into a practically limitless source of energy. And this is because coal is really nothing more than the remnants of primeval forests or jungles that existed at the time that dinosaurs roamed the earth. You can think of coal as fossilized sunshine from eons ago that got buried under the earth's crust. and is now an energy subsidy from the past. So tapping into this fossilized energy through steam engines gave people that were using steam engines immense economic advantages. This was a practically limitless energy source and one that was available at all times of the year. It just so happens, however, that in and around the Alps, the same geologic forces that produced coal did not locate them in the mountains. So the Alps were a coal-poor region. But people living in and around the Alps gazed up at the mountain peaks and thought if a way could be found to harness all of the power of that high energy water, then you would have a landscape of energy abundance. Because these mills, the one that you're looking at here on the screen, could not handle water falling much more than a few meters in distance. They simply could not withstand the forces of that. But if a way could be found to harness something falling from much greater heights, then you would have a new landscape of energy resources. Starting in the 1860s, just such a solution was found. In France, starting in France, engineers created a new water wheel, which you see at the center of this picture. They called a turbine. And this was essentially a metallic water wheel. Very quickly, the technology progressed to the point where turbines could handle the energy of water falling thousands of meters. And for this reason, these same French engineers who developed the turbine began referring to Alpine water as huile blanche, white coal. And this was a type of marketing. They were trying to convince the French public at the time that Alpine water power was this great new energy resource that would bring riches such as those that coal had brought to other areas. They would bring them to France. And so this change in technology and this new energy system that existed during the Industrial Revolution changed the way that people looked at the Alps. They no longer saw scary, imposing mountains. At least when engineers were looking, they saw potential energy. Now, it's conceivable that the story could have stopped here. With the development of these turbines, there was an explosion of industrial energy use in the Alps, particularly in the high valleys, and that it could have remained sort of a regional development. But some Europeans began to argue that this energy was in the wrong place. So this is that classic energy problem that I told you about, getting it in the right place at the right time in the right form. They argued that if a way could be found to get that water power into the cities, then you would have a market for all of the energy that was available in the Alps. A way needed to be found, they argued, to transport Alpine water power. So in the 1880s and 90s, this was one of the major engineering questions in Europe and really the world. Is there a way that we can we innovate a way to transport natural flows of energy like water? And in the event, it was discovered that electricity was not only a great way to create light, but it was also a way to transport energy over long distances. So what we're looking at here is a scene from one of the most famous moments in the history of electrification. This is the International Exhibition in Frankfurt, Germany of 1891. This has gone down in the annals of electrification history because this was when the breakthrough was made where engineers learned what needed to be done in order to transport electricity long distances. Essentially, high voltage transformers were used in order to be able to send power over land. Now, I show you this because the engineers who were working on this problem were working on it because they were trying to find a way to tap into the white coal of the Alps. The key innovators in this respect were Bavarians, were Swiss, were French, and they were all really, really animated by this question: how can we transport the water power of the Alps down to the plains? And the fact that they were interested in this problem is shown by the model waterfall that they constructed to celebrate their breakthrough. So what we can see here is a stylized Alpine waterfall. And so the connection to contemporaries was clear. By using electricity, we will be able to tap into the power of falls like these. So really, white coal in the Alps are actually, even though it's not really recognized, they play a major role in the spread of the electricity grids that underpin all of our current energy use. So by 1900, engineers had figured out how to get white coal in the right form and in the right place through using electricity. But there was one major problem still remaining, and that was the issue of timing. So like all natural flows of energy, like wind power, like solar power, the availability of alpine water fluctuates seasonally. When the sun's direct rays are farthest from the northern hemisphere, that's our winter season, then there's less water running off the mountains. That's because when there is precipitation in the Alps, it stays there in the form of snow or ice. Sometimes during the spring melt, there's almost too much water to be utilized by hydropower plants. So this was a huge problem for engineers, because electricity, if it's not used in the moment that it's created, it dissipates forever. It's also really difficult to store. And anybody that has cell phones or laptops knows about this a little bit. Battery technology existed at the time, but it's extremely expensive. So this was a huge problem. But looking around the Alps, some engineers noticed that the mountains possessed opportunities to store the water. And as I mentioned, these were lakes, existing lakes, and in glaciated valleys. So this was where sort of the key breakthrough was made that transformed the mountains into Europe's battery. A huge movement to try to store alpine water power starts around the turn of the century, and it really hasn't stopped up until the present. And what it does is it gives Europeans more control over this energy source. It allows them to make water power behave more like coal. It can be used at the push of a button. So what we're seeing in this diagram here is a picture of one natural alpine lake that was converted into an energy reservoir. So this lake, it's called the Walchensee, and is in the Bavarian Alps. It existed prior to hydropower development, and Bavarians decided to convert this into a natural dam, essentially. They tunneled through the mountain, holding it back from the plains, and in so doing, created an energy reservoir. So all over the Alps, as I mentioned, engineers were on the lookout for lakes and other opportunities to store water power and have more control over when it would be used. So by 1900 then, basically, engineers had figured out how to get alpine water power in the right place, in the right form, at the right time. Especially after the First World War, a huge boom in dam building sets off in the Alps. The war effort really required more energy, and the individual states engaged in the war wanted to substitute water power for coal. They needed coal for the trains, etc. I'm actually going to jump ahead a little bit in history and talk about alpine water power in the interwar period and as it relates to the National Socialist state, as we were talking about at the beginning. So in the interwar period, there were visions of how to employ this abundant, this energy landscape in Europe. And some people argued that alpine water power should be used for international cooperation. What we're looking at here is a plan from a German engineer published in 1930, in which we can see an argument to use the water power of the Alps to feed into a Europe-wide electricity grid. And this electricity grid was seen as a way to promote international cooperation in the wake of the First World War, in which nations had fought against each other and resulted in millions of casualties. So there was this idea that maybe energy sources like white coal could be used to foster international cooperation. Now, as the interwar period wears on, we see it replaced by other visions that saw using white coal to create national self-sufficiency in terms of energy, what often got spoken as autarky. And fascist Italy, but also Nazi Germany, viewed Alpine water power as keys to ensuring their country's energy security. And what we're looking at here is a Nazi German museum exhibit from 1938. And this was supposed to show the German public how Germany was going to be getting its electricity in the future. And what's key to notice here are the different types of power plants. You can see those in the models surrounding the map, but also the map. It shows Germany and its electricity grid. And what you should notice is here in the south, they are suggesting that numerous power plants be built, as well as transmission lines running from the Alps north to Germany. So the Alps were seen as a crucial part of Nazi Germany's future electricity supply. We can also see that characterized here in the form of a model of an Alpine dam. Now, while this museum exhibit was being designed, German energy planners in the 1930s were beginning to advocate that Germany annex Austria, which at that point in time was an independent state, that they annex this country in order to gain access to Austria's Alpine water power. And when Germany did, in fact, annex Austria in 1938, they immediately set up a state-owned corporation, the Alpine Electro Works, to begin building gigantic reservoirs in the Austrian Alps. What we're looking at here is a picture of none other than Hermann Göring breaking ground, shoveling the first load of dirt on one of these key Alpine dams that the Nazis wanted to build in the Austrian Alps above Salzburg. This took place in May 1938, so almost immediately after Austria had been annexed. So they set up this corporation that is supposed to carry out the construction of these dams. What we're seeing here is a map from December 1938, so just a few months later, and hopefully you can notice the outlines here of the previous Austrian state. Here's the capital of Vienna. Here is the very power plant that Hermann Göring was breaking ground on. The important thing to recognize here is the transmission lines. What we're seeing are demarcations of various power plants that are supposed to be built. But the goal of developing this white coal, this Alpine hydroelectricity, was to generate electricity that could be sent north to the industrial zones in Germany. And the idea was, by developing Alpine hydropower, Germany would use less coal. They could substitute Alpine hydroelectricity for coal, and then use that coal for things like creating synthetic jet fuel. You need actually fossil fuels in order to create synthetic jet fuel. And this was key to powering the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. So this is exactly why the German energy czar that I pointed out at the beginning, why he saw Alpine water power as so crucial, because Nazi Germany could use this electricity as a substitute for coal that it needed for other uses, critical war uses. Now, with the importance of electricity for the German war effort, one might ask why the Allies did not focus their bombing campaign on power plants. And in fact, the Allies favored the bombing of cities. In the Allied bombing campaigns, it was primarily cities that were target, with the belief that by bombing cities, one might cause the war to end sooner by enraging the population. And it is this focus on cities that we see why this model of an Alpine dam from that very museum I showed before got destroyed during an American bombing attack on the German city of Munich in February 1945. So the focus of the air war was on bombing cities. So for the most part, power plants went untargeted. And in the wake of the war, the United States conducted a strategic bombing survey to see what the efficacy of the bombing campaign had been. And this strategic bombing survey concluded that had the Americans and the British focused on targeting energy infrastructure, transmission lines, and power plants, that likely would have ended the war more quickly. Okay. I'm going to sort of breeze through a few images here that refer to hydropower, the creation of this Alpine energy landscape in the post-war period. It was really after 1945, under the auspices of economic reconstruction, that we see the greatest boom in dam building in the Alps. And I'm going to give you a few examples of some of these dams. Up until like roughly 1970, the pattern that we see is that dams are built ever higher up into the mountains and ever larger. And so what we're looking at here is a Swiss dam, the Grand Disance Dam, that the Swiss tout as being the highest wall in the world. This is because of its altitude. It's way up in the heights of the Swiss Alps, but it's also quite a tall wall itself. It's 285 meters in length. And here we see a picture of some Swiss children underneath this very dam. Hopefully you can get a little bit of a sense of how large indeed this wall is. And I like the contrast here of the sort of the Swiss kid wearing his mountain hat a little bit, and then this new modern technology. We can see, based on the example of Austria, that programs like the Marshall Plan played a huge role in funding post-war dam projects. So this is a poster advertising the US Marshall Plan in Austria, showing some of the projects that got funded. Here on the left, hopefully you can see an image of an Alpine dam being constructed. And in fact, this is the same dam that began construction under the National Socialists, the same dam where Hermann Göring went and broke ground. This is the dam in Kaprun near Salzburg that became a symbol of Austrian reconstruction in the post-war period. It has really sort of taken up a mythic status in Austrian society. Now I'd like to close by considering some of the consequences of creating Europe's battery. The story that I've told so far is one basically of engineers getting their way, having ideas and getting their way about these ideas. But in actuality, nearly every single dam project in the Alps was a source of social conflict. They were always challenged by nature conservationists, by local farmers, by local residents who standed to have their lives disrupted by the dam. So I don't want to give the picture that this was something that proceeded without conflict. There have also been some major disasters in the Alps. In fact, some of the worst dam disasters worldwide took place. The worst of these happened in 1963, when the Vayant Dam in northern Italy was overtopped by a tsunami. So this was a dam that was built in northeastern Italy in the Alps near Venice. And when it was being constructed in the 1950s, some people already then warned that it was being constructed in a geologically unstable area. And these people proved to be correct. What happened in October 1963 was that a section of the hillside above the Vayant Dam broke loose. There was a landslide, and it slid into the reservoir, which you can see here. So this section of earth sliding into the reservoir created a wave, a tsunami, that then overtopped the dam. And you can see the dam here at the bottom of the picture. The dam actually survived the wave. It was not washed away, but enough water washed out of the reservoir that it destroyed the villages below. And roughly 2,000 people lost their lives because of this dam disaster. We can see here one picture of the destruction that was wrought by this tidal wave essentially rushing down an alpine valley. So there have been major safety disasters, safety failures as a result of the creation of this energy landscape. I'm going to leave you then with one more sort of example of the ways that creating Europe's battery also changed the lives of people living in the Alps. And this is a picture also coming out of northern Italy. And it represents the old church tower of a medieval village in northern Italy, a village that was flooded after the Second World War in order to create an energy reservoir to store Alpine water power for the Italian industrial economy. So they created this dam that then flooded a number of villages, including this one that you see here. So the Italian state essentially decided that the inhabitants of this village, it was called Graun in northern Italy, had to move. There were something like 100 households in the village, and they were forced to relocate to the new shores of the lake that was created by this dam. And sort of a reminder of this fact of forced migration exists in the form of this tower that still sticks out of the lake for all to see. Now, we have examples of forced migration like this coming from every corner of the Alps, whether it's France, Switzerland, Austria, Italy. Dam projects often forced local populations to have to move. Okay, I'm going to conclude here. I've tried to give you a sense of why the Alps became such an important landscape of energy storage, why they became Europe's battery over the course of the 20th century. And it's because the mountains allowed Europeans to use water power in a way that it behaved most like coal, that it had the convenience of coal, that it could be produced with the push of a button, if you will. Now in the 21st century, we're faced with questions of how to get our energy in a way that doesn't worsen global warming. So a lot of people are now talking about having to increase the amount of renewable energy that we use. And so I hope that my history of one of the most important landscapes of renewable energy might show some of the problems we will confront as we face the energy future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Landry, for this fascinating talk. So now we have about 30 minutes left. I would like you to use the raise hand function, or also use the chat room to ask questions to Professor Landry. And to my students, please don't be shy to ask questions. He's here for you.
Let's see.
So, I'll check it. So I may ask a question if I'm sure there will be more questions. Oh, there is a question here. Do engineers plan on building more dams to meet demand of renewable energy in the future?
That's a good question, and it's a topic that's being discussed. In my talk, I mentioned that really up until the 1970s, we see this trend towards larger dams, higher in the mountain. And there's a reason why I said that this continued until the 1970s. It's because in the 1970s, there began to be a backlash against hydropower dam building. And this was based upon the emerging environmental movement worldwide. So there became a lot more resistance to the environmental impacts, if you will, of building large dams, and that sort of then has caused a slowdown in the amount of energy development. But as I mentioned, we're now dealing with climate change, global warming, and most experts say that we need to produce energy in a way that's not immediately producing carbon. So now hydropower is being discussed again. It's still not really fashionable to talk about building big dams, but it would be possible to do so if society eventually decided that was necessary. More is being focused on so-called micro dams, very, very small scale hydropower that doesn't have as big environmental impacts, but that towns could use to supply electricity. One other really interesting thing that I noticed at a conference recently, the new sort of state of the art and the trend where I think things are going with energy usage in the Alps is to use solar, but essentially the Swiss and other countries in the Alps have developed solar cells that float on balls in lakes and reservoirs. So the very same places that are producing hydropower energy are now being looked at as places where you could put solar energy cells. And so people are thinking along those lines too. But to answer your question then, there are still talks and there could still be more hydropower energy to be wrung out of the Alps, if you will. But the question is whether society is willing to pay the environmental and social consequences of big dams.
Thank you. There's a question also. Have you spent a lot of time visiting these places yourself?
Yes, thank you. I have been to a lot of these Alpine dams. It's sort of I grudgingly, as part of my research, will often have to go hiking in the Alps, and sometimes I've even skied past some of these dams, and I'm doing it all for science and for knowledge. It has nothing to do with the fact that these are nice places to visit as well. So no, yes, I visited quite a few, and I'm developing an extensive photo collection of Alpine dams.
I'll take question from Professor Johnson. So Professor Johnson, would you like to ask your question yourself, or may I read your question?
I'll go ahead and ask a question. Thank you. First of all, I'm so excited to see you talking about this project, Marc. I've been following you from a distance for a while, and it's great to see how clearly you're able to communicate themes that also involve some science and all sorts of different things to a very large audience here. So also congratulations to Minnesota for putting together such a great event. It's interesting to me to think about this kind of energy as renewable and sustainable, but then also as a real challenge, and to think of Alpine spaces as places that offer us opportunities to produce energies in ways that don't rely on fossil fuels, but also as spaces where we might want to really minimize the human effect on the environment, which obviously doesn't work, as your, the last 10 minutes of your presentation really dramatically showed. So I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit more about that tension, the tension between the more sustainable vision for energy that might involve more incursions into the Alps versus the need to protect animal habitats, conservation efforts, conflicts with the tourist industry in terms of needing the Alps to appear to be pristine for a variety of reasons. But, really I'm inviting you to talk even more about some of the arguments that you're making with this project that I'm so excited to see develop, if that doesn't sound like a dirty word after having the presentation.
Yes, thank you, and thank you so much for the it's it's kind of the key question, and in terms of the development of this project, yeah, I've been working on it a while, and really close to being finished with the manuscript, so I'm almost there. But yeah, this is really the question, and I don't know that I have the best answers for it, because it really is the key question, which is how do you balance these competing exclusive dictates, which is the need for energy, but then also mitigating the environmental consequences of using that energy. And so I think what I'm trying to show with my research is that although renewable energy, I think, is talked about very positively nowadays, and we hear it talked about as green energy, that we need to understand that even these types of energy come with costs, environmental costs that then are carry along with them social costs. And so, you know, that we need to be, I don't think that we should not believe that if we move to using more renewables, that we will have solved our problems. I think that these issues are going to persist because all forms of using energy, by getting it in the right place, in the right form, at the right time, we're going to be creating impacts. And so, I guess the question is, you know, if we can find a way to have conversations about how doing so can be equitable, realizing that there's going to be winners and losers in certain aspects. You know, if people's livelihoods are changed by the building of a dam, that, you know, there should be compensation. And so it's the key question. And I don't know exactly how to answer, other than to try to use a historical approach to show what some of these conflicts and impacts have looked like in the past. Do you have any thoughts? I mean, I'd be interested to hear.
I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is it's not your job to solve this problem. It's just, as you said, it's your job to help us think through aspects of the problem that we might be able to anticipate, or to learn from the past, or to understand how questions have been addressed in the past. I mean, I didn't mean to imply that I thought that you should figure this out. And I think it's great that you're raising these issues. I just think that's your job, and that's what you're doing. I can't wait to see it.
Thank you.
So now I'll take a question from Professor Bischoff, and then a question from Claire Westman and Maggie Penning.
Thank you, Igor. Mark, thank you for a wonderful talk. Let me just first make a comment and ask a question. The comment is, you sort of concluded with the displacement of people up on the Reschen Pass in the South Tyrol when that dam was built, you know, and the tower is sticking out of the water. And of course, this reminds me of the Marshall Plan era, when American Marshall Planners came to Europe to essentially tell the Europeans, do what we did in the Tennessee Valley Authority in the 1930s, you know, replicate the TVA in the Alps, if you will. There was a lot of displacement of people in the Appalachians too, so very similar conflicts. But obviously, they didn't think about those social costs. They just thought about economic development. That would be one comment. The question I have on that map about the Alpine Elektrowerke, I noted that that map doesn't have Western Austria, my home state of Vorarlberg, in it, which of course is terrible, you know. So anyway, in Vorarlberg, you know, the German investors developed a huge hydroelectric industry in the Ill Valley, the Illwerke, and they got most of their electricity in the Ruhr area then from the Vorarlberg region of Austria. You see, it sort of breaks out up there in the Tyrol. But of course, the point would be the same. This kind of transmission lines, by the way, which are very ugly aesthetically, the kind of transmission lines that you see here envisioned by the Nazis to be built to German population centers were essentially already built in the 1920s and 30s out of Vorarlberg to the Ruhr area. So I just wonder why in this map, I mean, that's not your problem, but why these map makers would not have included the Vorarlberg? Is it because the transmission lines already existed?
Yeah, so that I'm very perceptive that you noticed that. So it's true, in fact, from Vorarlberg in the 1920s was really sort of a pioneer worldwide in long distance transmission of energy. And this was when a transmission line was built from the Alps in Vorarlberg to send electricity to the German Ruhr area. And this was kind of a pioneering feat. And so the reason that Vorarlberg is not shown on this map is that essentially the furthermost Western Austria, Vorarlberg, was seen to be almost a fiefdom of this large Ruhr Electricity Company, the RWE it was called. And so when the Nazi state created these Alpine Elektrowerke, it was understood we get everything east of what RWE has. That's their territory. So they were very, very sensitive not to be viewed as intruding upon that territory, which was really sort of designated to the West German coal industrial area. And in fact, the reason that there is an Alpine Elektrowerke is basically because East Germany, the East German industrial zone, wanted its own Alpine transmission line. It wanted to replicate what West Germany had with Vorarlberg. So the history of your province actually plays a role in the development of these ideas to build an Eastern counterpart, if you will.
Thank you.
Yeah, and great point about the Tennessee Valley Authority. I mean, there's a lot to be looked at sort of the model that is developed in the United States and then spread worldwide about developing the resources of entire watersheds like the Tennessee Valley did. This was pioneering as well. There's also sort of a global story then related to what happens in the Alps. So the Alps in some ways are taking cues from what the Americans are doing, but when they start to build these large dams, there are engineering companies gaining expertise. And in the 50s and 60s, we see that a lot of Austrian companies, a lot of Swiss companies, a lot of French companies are then the main contractors in building large dams elsewhere in the world, in South America, in Asia, in Africa. So there's then a technology transfer out of the Alps and into what was referred to at the time as the third world. And this was also seen as a way to have economic development in order to ward off communism.
A lot of questions.
Yeah.
A lot of questions here. One from Claire Westman. She wrote, you mentioned that the engineers got backlash from environmental conservationists. If it was reducing the amount of heat being released in our environment, why was there backlash? And another question from Maggie Penning is about the jobs that the building of the dams brought to the area.
Both really great questions. And so I'll start with the first one. It makes sense. I mean, when you think about it, how could conservationists be mad about renewable energy? But the key is sort of to understand that in, let's say, 1900 or 1920, when some of these dams were being built, the perspective of conservationists was different than it is nowadays, right? Nowadays, when we worry about global warming, to us, anything that's carbon neutral seems great, and we should do that. But this was a different time period. They weren't talking about global warming yet. And so they had different concerns. And so particularly really before, up until the post-war period, it's up until after the Second World War, when ecology as a science starts to develop, the early conservationists weren't really worried about, let's say, impacts on species or on carbon. They were actually mostly worried about the aesthetic consequences of building dams, that it would ruin beautiful nature that was sort of seen as a stand-in for different national identities, right? Beautiful Swiss nature or Bavarian, as it were. So some of the early conservationists in particular they were more against how the landscape changing, how its look changing would be problematic, and not so much about what we would consider to be environmental consequences. So it just gets at the fact that, in the past, people viewed environmental change differently than they do now. In terms of whether the projects brought a lot of work to the area, they did not. So you're right in pointing that local villagers could get construction work building these dams, and that was true for a time. They did provide jobs, but once the project was completed, most of these power plants ran without much personnel. And in fact, some people at the time argued this was a positive for hydropower plants, because they pointed to the coal mines, the source of the other major energy of the time period. And they said, look what happens in the coal mines. When the miners there go on strike, they can paralyze our entire country. This is a problem. Hydroelectricity is better because as soon as we get this factory built, it's going to run more or less by itself. And so we won't have this situation where workers can disrupt our economy and society so easily. So the general thought is that hydroelectric development, for the most part, benefited communities outside of the Alps. Aside from some initial construction work, it was sending money to the plains, if you will.
Thank you. So a question about global warming. How has global warming affected the water cycle that is crucial for the function of these dams? And to this question, I'd like to also mention another one about, are there any mountain ranges that are used in this fashion, or are the Alps unique?
Really good question. So to answer the second one first, the Alps are unique in sort of the concentration of energy development, but also this focus on storage. And this is, I argue, because of sort of the Alps' unique position, sort of at the center of this urban industrial world that is one of the first to arise in world history, right? West Central Europe is one of the early centers of industrialization and urbanization. And so it plays this important role, or at least develops in this way, is how I'll put it. Now, if we look at something like the Rockies in the United States West, conditions there are much different. There is not as many cities around the Rockies, not as many population, not as high of a population living in the actual mountains as exists in Europe. And so things develop much differently there. The same could be said of the Himalayas, the Himalayas. This is a place where there's also very large dams, but they're not utilized in the same fashion as the Alps. And I would argue that's just sort of has to do with the unique societal situation around these mountains. To get to the question about global warming, this is a very important topic now, because in the Alps, since roughly 1850, the Alpine glaciers have been receding. They've been melting, and quite rapidly in some cases. So one of the reasons why the Alps were viewed as sort of a good, suitable place to develop hydropower was because the rivers there, the water courses there, ran relatively evenly. So the existence of glaciers is actually another way to store water in the mountains, and it evens out the differences in seasonal flows. It's kind of a buffer. And so people are worried that when the glaciers disappear, you're no longer going to have this more moderate, more even flow for alpine water courses, and that in the future there'll be much greater swings between low water periods and flood periods, which might then convince people of the necessity of building even more dams. So you're absolutely right to focus in on global warming as something that could really change the circumstances for this energy landscape.
Thank you, Marc. We have 5 more minutes, so and we have a few more questions. One is about the electric grids in Europe today. Are they national or regional? How does it work?
Also, really good question, and it's changed somewhat over time. It was really in the post-World War II period that the first efforts to make really European grids emerged. But at that time, the grids stopped at the Iron Curtain. So you essentially get the development of a Western European grid and an Eastern European grid. And for the most part, they were separate. Since 1989, that's changed. And now something like a European grid does exist. So it is possible to send electricity from the farther corners in order to sort of deal with different peaks and valleys in demand. But you know, the Alps kind of play a role in the development of these grids as well. And in the post-war period, what the Austrians, what the Swiss, what the French do is they essentially argue that they need to build these storage works so that they can serve as the auxiliary power for the grid, meaning that whenever there are spikes in demand, the Alpine dams can sort of kick on. Their hydropower plants are able to turn on quicker than any other type of plant. If it's a thermal plant like nuclear, it actually takes some time to power up or power down. But with water power, you can actually start generating electricity almost immediately. So these Alpine dams sort of serve the function of providing peak power for the grids. It's a great question.
Thank you. So here I'm scrolling down. So a question regarding World War II. So someone wrote, I'm wondering about, is Corbin Doughty, I'm wondering about the debate surrounding among the Allied leadership regarding the bombing of German energy. How prominent were the Alps in these debates? Who were the loudest voices pushing for the Alps as a target?
Yeah, so I'm not as knowledgeable on the actual discussions among the leadership as I am about the debates after the war, on sort of reflecting on how the bombing campaigns played out. So my sense is that those people who were pushing for greater focus on energy infrastructure during the campaigns weren't necessarily pushing to bomb Alpine dams, because these were actually very difficult targets to hit. This is another reason why some planners in Nazi Germany argued for increased development in the Alps, is that they'd be a little bit more protected in the Alps to build these dams. What they found out after the war was that it probably would have made most sense to go after coal plants, but also bombing like transformer stations, the places that are sort of responsible for increasing or lowering the voltage so that electricity can be sent around. The last thing I'll say about this is there is actually some historical not evidence, but you know, the Allies did actually bomb a few German dams. They were not in the Alps. They were in sort of like medium-sized mountain ranges in Western and Eastern Germany. And there was one famous bombing raid led by the British, where the British used specially developed bombs that were designed to be dropped onto the reservoirs created by the dams and then skip their way to the dam wall, where they would detonate and then destroy the dam. And so there was a very, very daring bombing raid that took place in 1943, where British bombers managed to destroy two sizable dams in Germany. But these were also, you know, these were heavily criticized as well, because they resulted in mass civilian deaths. So this was not just targeting energy infrastructure, it also resulted in civilian casualties.
Thank you. There's so much to say.
Yeah.
It's great to see the question. If I may, I will take one more question.
Sure.
This is a question from one of my students about hydropower and solar power, and if they are used also to power ski resorts and tourist attractions. And I like this question because you talked about conflicts, but here we can see maybe there a convergence of interests. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. So with the existence of a grid, it's sometimes hard to know exactly which electricity is going where. But certainly, lots of Alpine resorts like to tout, that they're using renewable energy, nearby renewable energy for tourist purposes. So I think this is something that's becoming ever more important, and it's also connected to the solar energy issue that I mentioned. Particularly in the Austrian case with which I'm familiar, there's a real push, an understanding that tourist infrastructure has had environmental impacts, and wanting to try to mitigate those impacts through the use of renewable energy. So I do see that as something that's going to be even more emphasized in the future, is that this ski area is powered completely by renewable energy and the like. And so yeah, that's another interesting place where the two topics kind of fold back in on each other. The question of sort of the economic resources of the Alps, and the landscape, which is responsible for producing the energy, but also is responsible for bringing the tourists and the visitors in as well, and sort of the need to establish a balance between both uses.
Well, thank you very much, Marc. It was a very fascinating talk, and thank you for sharing your research with us. So, on behalf of my whole class, I thank you. And as you can see in the chat, people also enjoyed very much your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I appreciate all the great questions, and thank you.